Peggy Sue Thomas was a former beauty queen looking for love under the bright lights of Las Vegas.
Peggy stood out in a crowd. Sexy, red hair, charming, sweet, and she was flirty.
James Huden was Peggy's former childhood crush, a successful software developer turned aspiring rock star.
Tall, charismatic, seemed larger than life.
And when the two reconnected 20 years later, they couldn't keep their hands off each other.
She just fell head over heels in love with him.
They barely left the bedroom.
But their red-hot romance would be put on ice by a mysterious crime.
He had been shot in the middle of the forehead, point-blank, assassination style.
Now, follow investigators as they delve into a world of sex, deceit, and passion as they try to solve a mystery more than 10 years in the making. And just when detectives think they've got the killers cornered, a natural disaster puts their capture in doubt.
He was there before the storm. After the storm, he can't be found.
They're all wondering if they're going to get away with murder.
2003, South Whidbey Island, Washington. A vacationing physician was walking into the woods with his two sons when they noticed something unusual.
They saw an abandoned car just sitting there.
And the dad takes the lead and he sees this image kind of hunched over the steering wheel.
It looked like the driver was either passed out or incapacitated.
The doctor instinctively hurried to provide medical assistance, but when he opened the door, he realized it was far too late.
There appeared to be a dead body.
The man quickly took his sons back to their cabin and called 911. Within minutes, the woods were swarming with officers from the Island County Sheriff's Department. The victim was a white male in his 30s.
He had been shot basically in the middle of the forehead.
But investigators wondered, were they looking at a suicide or a homicide? The answer to those questions would ultimately lay bare a startling web of conspiracy and unveil the shocking lengths two people would go for both love and revenge. Whidbey Island is a popular destination for vacationers seeking peace and quiet from Seattle. But for Peggy Thomas, growing up on Whidbey Island wasn't quite as relaxing.
Peggy's father was an officer signed to the Naval Air Station, and he ran a tight ship at home.
Peggy thrived on the discipline and followed in her father's footsteps by enlisting in the Navy in her 20s.
Peggy was a mechanic, and she worked on airplanes. And what I think is most interesting about her is Peggy was sweet as apple pie.
Peggy married a fellow sailor, and they went on to have 2 daughters together. By her 30s, Peggy had conquered both the military and motherhood. But there was one thing about Peggy that always bothered her.
She had always struggled with weight her whole life.
And after having 2 kids, Peggy had started to feel much more self-conscious about her physical appearance.
She was just thinking, you know, she's getting a little older, she's 32, she wants to be attractive.
She's like, I'm going to be strong, and I'm going to be beautiful, and I'm going to be something, and she sure was.
Peggy tackled her weight loss goals with a relentless dedication, losing nearly 100 pounds.
She just went from size 18 to tall, beautiful, and it was amazing transformation.
No one was more impressed than Peggy's closest friend, Brenna Douglas.
She and Brenna were best friends. I mean, they adored each other, and they were very much in each other's lives.
Brenna owned a beauty salon and helped Peggy make the most of her new figure with a glamorous makeover.
Everyone was so excited about her transformation, they even told her to enter a beauty pageant.
In 2000, Peggy entered the Mrs. Washington Beauty Pageant, a contest for married women of any age. Brenna took care of her hair and makeup. Peggy took care of the rest, winning easily.
She took that title in Washington State and just rode with it. Newspaper articles, making appearances, doing charity work. The title Ms. Washington actually changed Peggy's life.
And back on Whidbey Island, Peggy's newfound sex appeal won her a different kind of attention as well.
She drew attention from a lot of men.
It was the first time in her life that she was sexy, that men were attracted to her.
And after years of a safe and quiet marriage, the temptation of infidelity became too much for Peggy to resist.
She confided in me that she was having an affair with some guy down the street in her neighborhood.
But Peggy's infidelity didn't stop with just one lover. Peggy embarked on a string of illicit affairs, all fueled by both her growing self-confidence and her newly awakened desires.
I think that she loved the attention of the weight loss, and she just got caught up into her beauty. After years of knowing Peggy, I could see that she wasn't that interested in her husband.
But Peggy wasn't just bored with her marriage. She'd become dissatisfied with her entire life on Whidbey Island. The 34-year-old wanted more out of life. She wanted more glamour, more fun, more money.
Their income was pretty average. She thought she could just simply do better. She wanted a better guy that had more money.
With that goal in mind, Peggy divorced her husband. And even though it broke her heart to leave her dear friend Brenna behind, Peggy decided to pack up her 2 daughters and move to a place where rich men were in more ready supply, Las Vegas.
She fell in love with Las Vegas, and she said, "This is where I want to live." She could see the opportunities and the money and the men.
Peggy wanted it all: wealth, romance, adventure. And she had a plan for how she was going to find the Mr. Right who could give it to her.
She went to Las Vegas and became this driver for a limousine company.
She was chauffeuring around famous people, making really good money.
Of course, Peggy's favorite type of client was rich men.
She had one guy was giving her $100 every time she stopped, went and got him a hot dog. She took care of him. They took care of her.
But after months of chauffeuring high rollers and fat cats around the strip, a lasting romance continued to elude Peggy. Which made it particularly ironic that it wasn't until Peggy returned to Whidbey Island for the funeral of a friend that she finally found the man of her dreams. It was June of 2002, and 37-year-old Peggy had run into an old childhood crush at the graveside service, 49-year-old Jim Huden.
Jim was tall, charismatic, charming. He just seemed larger than life.
Though it was a strange place for romance, when Peggy laid eyes on Jim, she couldn't help but be struck by the same spark of attraction she'd felt as a schoolgirl. And from the way she caught him stealing looks at her at the funeral, Peggy had a good feeling that her old high school fantasies about Jim Huden were about to come true. Growing up on Whidbey Island, Jim Huden had always come across as a big fish in a small pond. But Jim was more than just one of the cool kids. He also excelled in school and had a knack for technology.
He was such a natural. He could build a computer within hours, literally from scratch.
After graduation, Jim turned his talents into profits, becoming a millionaire while he was still in his 20s.
He has the intellect to develop software that he sells to Microsoft for $1 million.
He does what most guys in their 20s would do. Take the money, hit the road.
Jim spent the next 20 years traveling around the country. When he hit his 40s, he moved to Florida, where the warm weather and sandy beaches convinced him to finally put down roots. Moving to Florida also allowed Jim to focus on his other passion: music. In 1998, he put a band together, Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists. And Jim's charisma made him a natural rock star.
He enjoys being on that stage. He enjoys having the guitar in his hand.
Jim's star power made both him and his band a hit with the local bar scene. It also made Jim pretty popular with the ladies. One of his biggest fans was a 31-year-old named Gene Spender. Jim and Gene began dating. After a few years, they were married.
You could tell that they were in love. You could tell that they had a great chemistry together.
At the time, Jim had thought he was ready to settle down, and for the first year of his marriage, he seemed happy. Then in 2002, Jim returned to Whidbey Island to attend the funeral of a friend. He saw a lot of old acquaintances on the trip, but one in particular took his breath away.
Peggy stood out in a crowd, sexy, red hair, charming, sweet, and she was flirty.
He certainly had some charisma, and I think Peggy was pretty impressed.
But what impressed Peggy the most was how successful he had become. The couple spent the rest of the night catching up.
They sort of hit it off, and one thing led to another.
The couple's connection was electric, and they spent the rest of the weekend in bed together. Peggy could barely contain her excitement when telling Brenna and the rest of her friends about her romantic reconnection with her old crush.
She called me up and she said she just fell head over heels in love with him.
Jim felt the same way about Peggy. When he'd left Florida, he was a happily married man. But when he returned just a few days later, he was unable to get Peggy off his mind. Jim and Peggy knew they had to see each other again, so Jim booked a trip to Vegas. Telling his wife Jean he was meeting with club managers to get a gig for the band.
He and Peggy, they barely left the bedroom the entire time they were there.
Over the next year, Peggy and Jim continued their affair.
Jim would look for any opportunity he could get to get back to Vegas to be with Peggy Sue.
And it was clear to both of them that this was more than just a long-distance affair. They were falling in love.
It's not a fling. Something solid was developing. It was developing quick.
As Peggy and Jim's relationship grew deeper, the time they spent together never seemed to be enough. But Jim's frequent trips were beginning to make his wife suspicious.
He was more secretive. He kept going to Vegas.
Jean had an understanding that something was going on in Las Vegas.
Finally, Jim decided he couldn't take it anymore. He admitted to the affair and asked Jean for a separation.
Jim told her he was leaving her.
Now free to explore the relationship with Peggy, Jim moved to Las Vegas, and the lovers lived extravagantly on Jim's $1 million fortune.
They went out. They were sort of living large, enjoying being in Las Vegas.
It's all about us. And here we are. They fuel each other.
The charismatic couple seemed to have it all. But their life of glamour and excitement was about to take an unexpected turn and lead to a deadly mystery that would baffle police for a decade. Coming up, the investigation into the dead man on Whidbey Island turns up its first clues.
They found a spent shell casing from a .38 handgun, along with the victim's cell phone.
And a surprising twist connects the crime back to someone in Peggy Thomas's past.
Turns out she had a lot to gain after all from her husband's death.
After spending most of her adult life fulfilling her duties in the military and as a mother, Peggy Thomas moved to Las Vegas in search of both romance and adventure.
She had an agenda. Her agenda was to marry a rich man.
But it wasn't until the former beauty queen returned home to Washington that she finally found what she was looking for in the arms of wealthy software developer turned rock star Jim Huden.
They hit it off, and one thing led to another.
By 2003, Peggy and Jim realized they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And Jim left his wife to join Peggy in Las Vegas. But while Jim and Peggy were embarking on a new and glamorous lifestyle together in Sin City, police back in their hometown of Whidbey Island were investigating a gruesome crime scene. On December 27th, Island County Police responded to a 911 call from a physician who discovered the dead body of a man in an abandoned vehicle.
He had been shot basically in the middle of the forehead. It looked like it was a point blank.
With no sign of a struggle, investigators wondered if the man might have driven out to the remote location to kill himself.
A lot of people probably would have thought that this was a suicide.
But that theory was quickly dismissed when they searched the car and were unable to come up with a weapon.
There's no gun, so it can't be a suicide.
However, they did find something else just inside the driver's side door.
They found a spent shell casing from a .38 handgun, along with the victim's cell phone.
The car's engine was turned off, and the victim's hands were still on the steering wheel, which told detectives that he'd most likely pulled over before the shooter caught him by surprise.
The guy didn't even have a chance to get his seatbelt off, just shot right through the window.
He was ambushed and shot and killed.
The victim's driver's license and registration identified him as 32-year-old island resident Russell Douglas, who was the husband of Peggy Thomas's best friend, Brenna Douglas. But police wondered what was Russell doing at the end of the remote road, and who would want to kill him.
There's a huge question early on in the case is what is this guy doing here?
Hoping to find some answers, detectives paid a visit to Russell's home and sat down with his wife, Brenna. But when they informed Brenna that her husband had been murdered, police were surprised by her reaction.
She is emotionless. There are no questions asked. Oh my God, how was he murdered? Where was his body found? It's just this lifeless reaction.
Brenna explained to police that Russell was her estranged husband. They'd been separated for some time and hadn't parted on good terms.
He's living in an apartment. She didn't even know the address of his apartment.
According to Brenna, Russell was an addict who abused drugs and alcohol, as well as sex. She told police that she'd stood by him for as long as she could, but finally had to end the relationship when he refused to get help.
The marriage was broken because of his, addicted personality to be it sex or be it alcohol.
But despite the breakup, Brenna's cold reaction to her ex-husband's murder left investigators curious.
The marriage is strange, but at some point, you still have to wonder, why no reaction?
Spouses are often the first suspects police turn to, and in this case, they couldn't help but wonder, did Brenna stand to gain anything from Russell's death?
Does your husband have a life insurance policy? I believe she says something like, well, I think so, a small one.
Police decided to take a closer look at Russell Douglas's life insurance policy and subpoenaed the records from the couple's insurance company. While they waited for the information, investigators looked into Brenna's claims about Russell's drug and sex addictions.
Maybe he'd hooked up with the wrong person online or gotten killed from a drug deal gone bad.
But when police followed up with Russell's friends and family, they described him very differently.
Russell was in control of his life. This wasn't someone who had an alcohol problem or a drug problem.
They paint a picture of a guy who was still in love with Brenna and also trying to work things out.
Someone wasn't telling them the truth. But who? Russell's loved ones or his estranged wife? Police hoped Russell's life insurance and financial records might help them figure out what was going on. When they received a copy of Russell's policy file from his life insurance agency, they saw he didn't have just one policy. He had two. Both were still active, and the combined payout wasn't small like Brenna claimed.
And we find, there's two, $300,000 and $200,000.
To investigators, the sizable insurance policy proved that Brenna had been lying to them. It also meant something else.
Brenna had a motive.
But did that mean she shot her husband in cold blood? Had she hired someone else to do it? Or had Russell Douglas's murder been triggered by something much darker than simple greed? Little did police know that their hunt for answers would take them far from the woods of Whidbey Island and into a world of sex, lies, and dangerous secrets. Coming up, Russell's phone records lead police to Brenna's best friend.
When detectives called that number, it turned out it was Peggy Sue.
And a surprise witness emerges over 2,000 miles away.
There's something eating at him for weeks. Something bad.
After Peggy Thomas had left her husband, she started a red-hot love affair with her old childhood crush, Jim Huden.
She just fell head over heels in love with him.
But their whirlwind romance was about to collide with a shocking murder investigation back in their hometown of Whidbey Island, Washington.
Peggy's best friend, Brenna Douglas, had just been told her husband, Russell, had been found murdered on the side of the road.
he was ambushed and shot and killed, still sitting in his car.
Brenna Douglas's cold reaction to her husband's death had left police wondering whether she might have been involved. And their suspicions were strengthened by the discovery that Brenna stood to gain $500,000 in insurance money.
The focus turns more and more on Brenna.
Maybe with the problems they're having, she's thinking, you know what? I'd be better off without her.
But when investigators looked into Brenna's whereabouts on the day of the murder, they were disappointed. While Brenna's reaction might have been suspicious, her alibi was airtight. She had spent the entire day of the murder with her family, and all of them vouched for her.
She couldn't have been the one who shot her husband because she never left the house.
There's nothing there to pin her. There was no direct piece of evidence.
But if Brenna didn't kill her husband, then who did? And why? With their first lead resulting in a dead end, investigators decided to obtain phone records from Russell's cell provider and went through all of the calls he'd received in the weeks leading up to his death.
They're looking for patterns, anything out of the ordinary. Names, dates, times.
Police were able to link all of the numbers to Russell's friends and family on Whidbey Island. That is, all but one.
They find a number with an out-of-state area code that called him right around Christmas.
There was 4 incoming calls from the same number and then 3 outgoing calls.
To detective surprise, the phone number's area code turned out to be from Las Vegas, Nevada.
They've got to be wondering if Russell had a gambling addiction.
But when investigators followed up on the number, they discovered it wasn't a bookie who'd been calling Russell. It was a former Whidbey Island resident.
When detectives called that number, it turned out it was Peggy C.
Peggy told detectives that she did know Russell Douglas, but only through her relationship with his wife, Brenna. Peggy explained that she'd been visiting family on Whidbey Island for Christmas. She called Russell because she had a gift for Brenna. Peggy wanted it to be a surprise, so she asked him to give it to Brenna for her. Peggy told police she'd arranged to meet Russell on December 23rd, 3 days before the murder.
Peggy got it to Russell. Russell made sure that Brenna got it.
After that, she went back to Las Vegas and hadn't really heard from Russell or Brenna since then.
It was an innocent enough explanation for the calls. Once again, it seemed like a promising lead turned out to be a dead end. Investigators were desperate to find Russell's killer, but they knew that with each passing day, the trail was only getting colder.
That's what, frustrated authorities for such a long time is who could this possibly be? Who would do something like this?
Then, over 6 months after the murder, their luck finally changed. On July 26, 2004, detectives at the Island County Sheriff's Department received a call from an unidentified man who wanted to know if there had been any unsolved murders on Whidbey Island in the past year.
Their radar immediately goes off. They try to keep this guy on the line because you know what? He might know something.
Police said, yes, there had been a murder on Whidbey Island, and the guy's name was Douglas.
It had been 6 months since the murder of Russell Douglas. The caller identified himself as Bill Hill, a resident of Punta Gorda, Florida. And although he was calling from the other side of the country, Bill told police he was good friends with another former resident of Whidbey Island.
Bill Hill was Jim Huden's friend in the band in Florida.
Bill told detectives that his old bandmate Jim Huden had returned to Punta Gorda for a visit in February, which was just 2 months after the murder. But when Bill got together with Jim at a local bar to catch up, he immediately noticed Jim was no longer the carefree rock and roller he used to be. As one of Jim's oldest friends, Bill was concerned. He pressed Jim for answers.
Jim finally tells Bill that there's been something eating at him for weeks. Something bad.
Bill told police that was when Jim made a shocking confession.
Jim had told Bill one of his darkest secrets was that he had killed this man on Whidbey Island.
Investigators knew they finally got the break they'd been looking for. But would they be able to apprehend their new suspect before it was too late? Coming up, A natural catastrophe upends the investigation
Hurricane Charlie hit Punta Gorda.
and leads to Jim Huden's sudden disappearance.
He was there before the storm. After the storm, he can't be found.
By 2004, the romance between former beauty queen Peggy Sue Thomas and aspiring rock star Jim Huden seemed to be thriving amid the lights of Las Vegas. But when Jim returned to Punta Gorda, Florida, he made a shocking confession to his former bandmate, Bill Hill.
Jim told Bill one of his darkest secrets was that he had killed this man on Whidbey Island.
Bill had called Island County detectives, who immediately suspected the person Jim murdered was Russell Douglas, who was mysteriously shot on the island in 2003. But what connection did Jim Huden have to Russell Douglas? And what would his motive have been to kill Russell in cold blood? Bill told police that Jim had spent the last couple of years living the high life in Las Vegas with his girlfriend, Peggy Thomas. But Jim claimed a dark shadow had been cast over their happiness. When Peggy discovered that her best friend, Brenna Douglas, who was Russell's wife, was trapped in an abusive marriage.
Brenna's husband was abusive to Brenna and their children.
Jim had said Peggy was so upset about the abuse that she insisted they do something about it. But Peggy hadn't just wanted to help Brenna leave Russell. She wanted to take him out of the picture permanently.
Peggy had propositioned Jim to take out Brenna's husband.
This is her best friend in the whole world. Of course she'll do anything for her.
But instead of dismissing the idea, Bill said that Jim had embraced it.
Jim had had a terrible childhood. His stepfather was abusive.
And Bill explained to police that when it came to domestic violence, Jim hadn't been shy about telling his friends that he had a chip on his shoulder.
And he swore that if he could ever do somebody in that was doing that to their family, he would do it.
Jim's love for Peggy meant that he would do anything for her. And Peggy's proposition also finally gave Jim a chance to avenge his own abuse.
He didn't like anybody who was an abuser, so he agreed that he would murder this man because he was an abuser.
Jim told Bill that he and Peggy traveled to Whidbey Island a few weeks later, but their visit wasn't just about visiting with family.
So Peggy took Jim to a local bar where she knew Russell would be.
Peggy Sue pointed the guy out to him. He never shook hands with the guy, never met him or anything.
The next day, Peggy called Russell and made arrangements to meet him on the wooded road under the pretense of handing over a gift for Brenna. And on the day of the murder, Peggy and Jim watched as Russell drove up.
Peggy approached on the passenger side, Jim approached on the driver's side and tapped on the window.
But when Russell rolled his window down, Jim didn't hand him a gift.
He just raised the gun and shot him in the head.
It was a shocking story, but police knew Bill Hill's statement alone wasn't enough to arrest Jim and Peggy for murder. Police also needed to figure out what Brenna's role was in her husband's death. And had Jim and Peggy really killed Russell Douglas because he was abusive? Or was there another motive at play? A $500,000 motive, to be exact.
Was it about the life insurance policy and they were going to all divvy it up?
At face value, they didn't seem likely. After all, why would a millionaire couple like Jim and Peggy be tempted to murder for money? But as police soon learned from the couple's friends, Jim and Peggy weren't as rich as people believed. It seemed the couple had spent the majority of Jim's cash on their lavish Las Vegas lifestyle.
They weren't working. The rest of that money ran out. And they were scraping bottom. I mean, she was digging in the backseat of her car for money to buy a gallon of milk.
In fact, to the couple's friends, it seemed like Peggy and Jim would have done anything to get their hands on more cash, including murder.
The motive had to have been money. That's all they talked about. That's all they needed. Money to continue the lifestyle they were building.
To get to the bottom of things, police needed to speak with all 3 suspected co-conspirators. They started with Brenna Douglas, but she was less than willing to cooperate with the investigation.
Brenna hired an attorney. The attorney told her not to talk, and so she pretty much clammed up.
With Brenna stonewalling, police turned next to Jim Huden, who was still in Punta Gorda, Florida, visiting friends. They questioned him at a local police station about the incriminating statement they'd received from Bill Hill. But Jim denied having anything to do with the murder.
You know what you've told Bill. The guy's falling apart over the guilt he's carrying around because you told him what you did. I don't buy that for a minute.
After professing his innocence, Jim quickly ended the interview. Next, police turned to Peggy. For 2 days, police questioned Peggy with her attorney present. And for 2 days, Peggy denied she knew anything about Russell Douglas's murder.
I do not have any involvement. I've told you what I know.
With no hard evidence to connect Jim, Peggy, or Brenna Douglas to the crime, police felt like they'd hit another dead end. But detectives were still convinced that the confession Jim Huden had given Bill Hill was the truth. They just needed proof.
They start thinking, if Jim confessed to Bill, maybe there are others out there. People who know something, or better, saw something.
In an attempt to find witnesses, police officially named Jim a person of interest in Russell's death and made a plea through the media for anyone with incriminating information about the couple to call police.
Right around that time, there was a Crime Stoppers notice that went out.
The move quickly paid off. On August 19th, investigators received a phone call from another one of Jim Huden's friends.
There was a gentleman, Keith Ogden, who had trained Jim Huden on how to use a gun months before this murder happened.
Keith Ogden was a former police officer who became friends with Jim in Las Vegas. He told investigators that he'd helped Jim buy a .38 caliber handgun.
So Jim wants to learn how to shoot. So what does he do? Takes him to a gun range and teaches him the basics.
Jim's desire for a handgun hadn't seemed suspicious to Keith at the time, but he thought it was odd when a few months later, Jim called Keith and asked him to take the gun back.
After the murder happened, Jim Huden turned the gun back over to Keith Ogden and said, "Can you hold on to this for me?"
Investigators wondered, was the .38 caliber pistol Jim returned to Keith the same gun used to shoot Russell Douglas? Hoping to find out, investigators retrieved the gun and turned it over to ballistic specialists for testing, along with the single bullet casing found at the scene. And the results confirmed their suspicion.
Just as they suspected, ballistics was able to match the shell casing to the .38.
They have the murder weapon.
Paired with Bill Hill's statement, police finally had the evidence they needed to place Jim Huden under arrest. But when investigators contacted Punta Gorda police to apprehend their suspect, they quickly learned there was a problem.
Hurricane Charlie hit Punta Gorda. It devastated our community here.
And it seemed Jim Huden had taken full advantage of the chaos.
We don't know what happened to him. He was there before the storm. After the storm, he can't be found.
Was it possible that Jim Huden had been a victim of the hurricane? Or had he realized police were coming after him and gone on the run? With their prime suspect missing, investigators had once again hit a dead end. They also didn't have sufficient evidence to charge either Peggy Thomas or Brenna Douglas with the crime.
They didn't have enough to bring any charges against Peggy because there wasn't any concrete evidence.
In an attempt to find Jim, investigators kept Peggy under surveillance, hoping that if Jim was still alive, he might try to reconnect with his girlfriend. But he never showed up.
Months go by and there's no sign of Jim. It's like he vanished off the face of the earth.
Adding to the mystery was the fact that Jim's body was never found in the cleanup after the hurricane. And as the months turned to years, investigators began to give up hope that Jim Huden would ever turn back up. It seemed Peggy Thomas had given up too. 3 years later, Peggy moved on from her missing lover, marrying one of the high rollers she chauffeured around Las Vegas. But while Peggy's love affair with Jim had been fueled by passion, it appeared that her latest marriage was simply a cash grab, a fact that wasn't lost on her new husband.
He was a wise man because he figured it out and got a quickie divorce.
But Peggy still got what she was after.
She walks away with almost $1 million and a new houseboat.
Peggy might have been doing all right for herself, but in the years since Jim Huden disappeared, there was one person who wasn't faring as well. Jim's estranged wife, Jean Huden.
Jean liked to party. The police were always watching her. They would pull her over. They would find small amounts of drugs. They would arrest her.
And she winds up getting charged with, I want to say, 19 or 20 felonies.
By 2011, Jean was facing significant jail time for compiled drug charges.
They were going to throw the book at her and she was going to go to prison.
Desperate to avoid prison, Jean told prosecutors she wanted to cut a deal. In exchange for her drug charges being dropped, Jean said she was willing to share information about a notorious cold case that remained unsolved.
She said she knew things about the murder on Whidbey Island.
She said she also knew how to find the crime's #1 suspect, who had been missing for 7 years, her estranged husband, Jim Huden.
She had information to share, and she finally decided to give that information out.
Coming up, Jean gives police more than they bargained for. But will it be enough to bring charges against the suspected co-conspirators?
He never said anything that would indicate that Peggy was involved.
The passionate affair between ex-beauty queen Peggy Thomas and musician Jim Huden had come to a shocking end when police issued an arrest warrant for Jim in connection to the 2003 murder of Russell Douglas. But before detectives could apprehend Jim, he suddenly disappeared.
That was the beginning of a 7-year hunt for Jim Huden.
Then in 2011, investigators finally got a break in the case. Faced with a slew of felonies, Jim's estranged wife, Jean, offered to tell investigators where to find the missing fugitive in exchange for her own freedom.
He'd been in Mexico the entire time. She had met Jim many, many times, given him money so he could survive.
He lives a totally different life, teaching music lessons to kids in Mexico under the name of Maestro Jim.
But that wasn't all. Jean told police that before Jim went on the lam, he confided in her about the murder on Whidbey Island.
James came to Jean and said, yeah, I killed him. I killed Russell.
While Jim had admitted that he was the one who pulled the trigger, he never revealed anything that implicated Brenna Douglas in the crime. But he did tell Jean that it was Peggy who'd come up with the plan.
Peggy, implemented it and did entice her boyfriend to shoot the guy.
One of the strongest pieces of evidence they have against Peggy Sue is the statements by Jean Huden.
She can corroborate all of the evidence they gathered thus far.
On June 9th, Mexican police apprehended Jim Huden in Veracruz, and he was extradited back to Washington State to face murder charges. Shortly thereafter, U.S. authorities placed Peggy Thomas under arrest as well.
They go down there and arrest her in a surprise arrest by her houseboat.
In July of 2012, Jim Huden's murder trial began. Prosecutors presented a strong case, including testimony by Bill Hill, Keith Ogden, and Jean Huden.
They have the murder weapon. They have statements from witnesses who basically say, well, Jim, he told me he did it.
But Jim's attorneys had a witness of their own, who claimed Jim couldn't have committed the murder because he wasn't even on the island at the time.
One of Jim's childhood friends, Ron Young, testifies that he and Peggy were visiting him in Seattle on December 26th.
They left before Christmas. They never go back to Whidbey Island.
Hoping to catch the defense in a lie and seal Jim's fate, prosecutors called one last witness, Peggy Thomas. But if they were expecting Peggy to turn on her lover, they would be disappointed.
Peggy Sue never sells out Jim.
She refuses to testify.
Between Peggy's refusal to cooperate and Jim's new alibi, the jury's decision was anybody's guess.
They're all wondering, is this guy gonna get away with murder?
The court wouldn't have to wait long to get an answer. On July 23rd, after just 5 hours of deliberations, the jury announced they'd reached a verdict. Jim Huden was found guilty of first-degree murder.
He got 80 years and the rest of his life in prison.
In 2013, it was Peggy's turn to stand trial. But unlike Jim Huden, Peggy and her attorneys weren't willing to roll the dice on a jury trial. Facing 30 years to life if convicted, Peggy's defense team approached the state to work out a plea deal. She pled guilty to rendering criminal assistance, which came with a shockingly short jail sentence.
The verdict was that Peggy got 4 years, and quite frankly, I was dumbfounded.
But even with Peggy and Jim behind bars, there were still more questions than answers about Russell's murder, especially when it came to his wife, Brenna.
Brenna was not charged with anything.
Had Brenna asked Peggy to kill her husband? Or had Peggy taken matters into her own hands? And what was their real motive?
Was this about putting a stop to domestic abuse? Or was it about insurance money?
There's so many questions that I don't think you're ever going to find truly an answer to.
Whether Russell Douglas's murder had been motivated by greed or revenge, one thing was certain. The heinous crime was proof of both the limits people would cross and the secrets they were willing to keep when fueled by lust and obsession.
He never said anything that would indicate that Peggy was involved, and that's what saved her. He's in jail forever, and Peggy goes to jail for 4 years, all because of him. He loves Peggy and is willing to spend the rest of his life in jail for Peggy.
For years, the city of Spokane, Washington, carried on with a quiet rhythm familiar to countless American communities. Tree-lined neighborhoods, military families, churches, schools, and small businesses created the image of a place where life followed predictable routines. People went to work, raised children, greeted neighbors, and expected tomorrow to look much like today. Yet beneath that appearance of normalcy, another reality was quietly unfolding. One woman disappeared, then another, then another. Some vanished after dark. Some were last seen entering a stranger's vehicle. Others simply seemed to disappear from the margins of society, leaving behind only fragmented memories, incomplete police reports, and families who waited for answers that refused to come. At first, these disappearances did not appear to form a pattern. The victims came from difficult circumstances. Many struggled with addiction. Several had engaged in prostitution to survive. Their lives often unfolded outside the attention of the broader public, and when they disappeared, their cases rarely generated sustained headlines. Investigators were forced to examine each case individually, often with little physical evidence and few reliable witnesses. Years passed. Bodies were discovered in remote locations. Some victims had been shot. Others had been left in wooded areas or alongside isolated roads, places where they might remain undiscovered for months or even years. Still, the cases remained disconnected. No one yet realized that a single individual was responsible for many of them. The man behind these crimes did not resemble the image most people associate with a serial killer. He did not live alone in isolation. He was not known as a violent drifter or career criminal. Instead, he wore a military uniform. He raised children. He held steady employment. Neighbors described him as polite and reserved. Co-workers saw someone who performed his duties without attracting attention. To those around him, Robert Lee Yates appeared to embody responsibility and stability. It would take more than 2 decades before investigators uncovered the devastating truth that these two identities, the devoted family man and the calculated murderer, belonged to the same person. The story of Robert Lee Yates is not only the story of one of Washington State's most notorious serial killers. It is also a story about overlooked victims, evolving forensic science, and the painful consequences of assumptions that allowed a predator to remain hidden for years. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself through obvious warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary routines, familiar smiles, and lives that seem completely unremarkable. Before investigators ever learned his name, the victims had already paid the price. Understanding how this happened requires looking first at the man himself, not to glorify him, but to understand how someone could conceal such extraordinary violence beneath an ordinary exterior for so long. Robert Lee Yates was born on September 27, 1952, in Spokane, Washington. Unlike many notorious offenders whose early years are marked by documented violence or persistent criminal behavior, the available records concerning Yates do not describe a childhood filled with extraordinary warning signs. There are no confirmed accounts of repeated juvenile arrests, no verified reports of extreme cruelty toward animals, and no evidence in the available records suggesting the kind of public behavioral escalation that often attracts early attention. Those who knew him during his younger years generally described him as quiet, reserved, and unremarkable. He did not stand out as a charismatic leader, nor was he remembered as someone constantly seeking conflict. In many respects, he blended into the background. After finishing school, Yates entered the United States Air Force, beginning a military career that would become a defining part of his public identity. Military service demanded discipline, routine, and responsibility. It also provided extensive familiarity with firearms, a skill that would later become significant during the criminal investigation. At the time, however, nothing about his military service suggested that he posed a danger to those around him. Like countless other servicemen, he followed orders, fulfilled assignments, and continued building what appeared to be a conventional adult life. During these years, Yates married and began raising a family. Eventually, he and his wife would have 5 children. Friends and neighbors saw a husband and father participating in everyday family life. He maintained employment and accepted responsibilities expected of an adult supporting a household. Following his military service in the Air Force, he later served in the National Guard and worked as a correctional officer. These occupations carried an expectation of trust. A correctional officer is responsible for maintaining security and order inside correctional facilities. Military personnel are expected to uphold discipline and public service. Both careers reinforced the perception that Robert Yates was dependable, responsible, and law-abiding. This public image would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Those closest to him did not recognize the existence of another life hidden beneath the surface. His neighbors described a man who kept largely to himself. He was neither especially outgoing nor openly hostile. He appeared ordinary, almost forgettable. There was nothing about his appearance or daily routine that immediately suggested he was capable of extraordinary violence. Unlike offenders who draw attention through erratic behavior, Yates remained remarkably consistent in presenting himself as a conventional family man. This ability to separate his public life from his criminal actions became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation after his arrest. Investigators and psychologists would later observe that Yates maintained 2 entirely different worlds. One was visible to everyone around him: husband, father, veteran correctional officer, National Guard member. The other remained hidden for decades, known only through the growing number of women who disappeared after crossing paths with him. Importantly, there is no verified evidence that those closest to him knew about his crimes while they were occurring. His family expressed shock following his arrest, reflecting the enormous gap between the man they believed they knew and the evidence eventually presented by investigators. This contrast became central to public reaction once the case emerged. Many people struggle to understand how serial offenders can maintain seemingly ordinary lives while committing repeated acts of violence. The Yates case illustrates just how effectively appearances can conceal reality. Nothing in his daily routine appeared extraordinary. He went to work. He returned home. He fulfilled family responsibilities. To casual observers, he blended seamlessly into the surrounding community. Yet during the years that his public life appeared stable, investigators would later determine that he was selecting vulnerable women, transporting them to isolated locations, shooting them with a .25 caliber handgun, and abandoning their bodies where discovery might take weeks, months, or even years. The victims he chose shared important similarities. Many were women living on the margins of society. Several struggled with drug addiction. Others survived through prostitution. Their vulnerability made them easier to approach and, tragically, less likely to generate immediate large-scale investigations when they disappeared. This reality would become one of the greatest obstacles facing detectives in the years ahead. At the time, however, no one had yet connected these disappearances to Robert Lee Yates. His carefully maintained public identity continued to shield him from suspicion. Behind the appearance of an ordinary American family lived a man whose crimes would eventually span more than 2 decades. The first confirmed victim had already disappeared, but investigators had no reason to suspect that her case marked the beginning of one of the longest and most devastating serial murder investigations in Washington state history. That realization would not come until many years later, after evidence, science, and persistence finally converged to expose the man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. In the summer of 1975, Spokane appeared much like any other growing American city in the Pacific Northwest. Families gathered for community events, young adults attended parties, and warm July evenings encouraged people to spend more time outdoors. Nothing suggested that one ordinary night would later become the starting point of a murder. Investigations spanning more than 2 decades. At the time, no detective, journalist, or resident could have imagined that a disappearance occurring that summer would eventually be recognized as the first confirmed chapter in one of Washington state's longest-running serial murder cases. The victim was 21-year-old Dorothy Marie Silzel. On July 17, 1975, Dorothy attended a party in Spokane. According to the available information, this would be the last time she was known to be seen alive. After leaving the gathering, she disappeared without explanation. Her absence quickly became a matter of concern. Family members reported her missing, hoping that investigators would discover where she had gone and what had happened after she left the party. Missing person investigations in the mid-1970s faced challenges very different from those of modern law enforcement. Surveillance cameras were rare. Digital records did not exist. Mobile phones could not provide location histories because they did not yet exist in everyday life. Investigators relied heavily on witness interviews, physical evidence recovered at scenes, and the ability to reconstruct movements through traditional investigative work. In Dorothy's case, there were few answers. Detectives searched for witnesses and followed available leads, but nothing produced the breakthrough they desperately needed. Without a crime scene, a body, or forensic evidence pointing toward a suspect, the investigation gradually reached a dead end. Cases like Dorothy's often become increasingly difficult with every passing week. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Physical evidence deteriorates or disappears entirely. Every unanswered question makes the next question even harder to solve. Dorothy's family continued living with uncertainty, not knowing whether she was alive or dead, whether she had chosen to disappear or had become the victim of a crime. That uncertainty lasted for years. A decade after Dorothy vanished, investigators finally recovered the first major piece of evidence. In 1985, skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area near Spokane. The remains were identified as Dorothy Marie Silsel. While the discovery confirmed that she had not simply disappeared voluntarily, it did not immediately reveal who was responsible for her death. The passage of 10 years had severely limited the available forensic opportunities. By the mid-1980s, forensic science had advanced compared to a decade earlier. But the technology available to investigators remained far more limited than what would emerge during the following 15 years. DNA profiling was still in its infancy and would not become a routine investigative tool for many years. As a result, investigators could not identify the killer through scientific analysis. Dorothy's death became another unsolved homicide. Her family finally had confirmation that she had died, but they still had no explanation, no arrest, and no justice. The identity of the person responsible remained unknown. Unknown to investigators, however, the man responsible was continuing his ordinary life without attracting significant suspicion. Robert Lee Yates remained publicly defined by his roles as a husband, father, military serviceman, and later a correctional officer. Nothing in his outward appearance linked him to Dorothy's death. No witness identified him as a suspect. No forensic evidence available at the time connected him to the crime. The investigation had effectively reached a standstill. Years later, after his arrest, Yates admitted responsibility for Dorothy Silsel's murder. According to his confession, he picked her up in his vehicle, drove her to an isolated location, and shot her with a handgun. His admission finally answered questions that had remained unresolved for decades. What investigators had once considered an isolated, unsolved homicide was instead the beginning of a much larger pattern that would only become visible after many additional victims had already lost their lives. The period that followed Dorothy's murder became one of the greatest mysteries in the entire investigation. After 1975, there appeared to be an extended gap before the next known series of killings linked to Robert Yates. More than 10 years passed without investigators recognizing another confirmed murder connected to him. This long interval has remained the subject of considerable discussion among investigators because it complicated every effort to understand his criminal history. During these years, Yates continued living what appeared to be an ordinary life. He remained connected to military service, including service in the National Guard after leaving the Air Force. His responsibilities required discipline and regular commitments that reinforced the public perception of stability. At home, he continued raising 5 children with his wife. Neighbors observed a quiet family living an apparently conventional existence. Co-workers saw someone fulfilling professional responsibilities without drawing unusual attention. There were no obvious signs suggesting that the same individual had already committed murder. Investigators have acknowledged that this lengthy period created enormous challenges once the case was eventually reopened. Some experts considered the possibility that Yates may have committed additional crimes while serving in different locations during his military career. Because military service often required relocation, any crimes committed outside Spokane might never have been connected to the investigation. However, the available evidence has not been sufficient to establish responsibility for additional murders beyond those officially attributed to him. For that reason, investigators have remained cautious, distinguishing between confirmed victims and unproven possibilities. Another explanation for the apparent gap involves the limitations of criminal investigations during that era. Cases occurring in different jurisdictions were often handled independently, making it difficult to recognize patterns across cities or states. Databases capable of rapidly comparing evidence did not yet exist in the form investigators rely upon today. If similar crimes occurred in separate locations, detectives might never realize they were dealing with the same offender. Lost evidence also remained a concern. As years pass, physical evidence naturally deteriorates. Witnesses forget details. Records become incomplete. Opportunities that seem insignificant at the time can later prove impossible to recover. Every unsolved case carries the risk that crucial information may disappear before investigators understand its importance. In the years after Dorothy's murder, none of these possibilities could be fully resolved. What remained clear was that Robert Yates successfully avoided suspicion throughout this period. His ability to maintain two separate lives became increasingly remarkable. On one side stood the dependable serviceman, family man, and employee. On the other stood an individual who had already committed a homicide that would remain unsolved for decades. This separation between appearance and reality would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. It also helps explain why investigators initially struggled to imagine that the offender could be someone so deeply integrated into the community. While police searched for unknown suspects and pursued scattered leads, Yates continued living among the very people trying to understand the growing mystery. The years of silence also had another consequence. When women began disappearing again during the late 1980s, investigators did not immediately connect those new cases to Dorothy Silsel's unsolved murder from more than a decade earlier. Too much time had passed. The circumstances appeared different. Each investigation began as its own tragedy rather than as part of a larger pattern. This delay would ultimately allow the killer to continue operating for many more years. Looking back after his conviction, investigators recognized that Dorothy's murder had not been an isolated crime at all. It was the first confirmed act in a series that would eventually claim at least 13 victims. Yet in 1975, there was no way to know that the unanswered questions surrounding one young woman's disappearance would foreshadow a much darker future for Spokane. The silence following Dorothy's death created the illusion that the danger had passed. In reality, the threat had simply become invisible, waiting for the moment when it would emerge again and leave investigators facing an even larger and more devastating mystery. For more than a decade after the murder of Dorothy Marie Silsel, there appeared to be little to connect her unsolved case to any larger pattern. Investigators had no identified suspect, no forensic technology capable of pointing toward a single offender, and no reason to believe that Spokane would eventually become the center of one of Washington State's most disturbing serial murder investigations. Yet as the late 1980s approached, a troubling reality slowly began to emerge. Women were disappearing again. At first, each case appeared to stand alone. A missing woman here, a body discovered there. Different locations, different circumstances, different timelines. Like many homicide investigations involving vulnerable victims during that era, each file was opened independently, examined on its own facts, and often left without enough evidence to move forward. It would take years before investigators recognized that these tragedies were connected by a single offender whose routine had become increasingly methodical. The women who disappeared during this period shared striking similarities. Most were involved in prostitution. Many struggled with drug addiction. Several lived unstable lives without permanent housing or dependable support systems. These circumstances did not make their lives any less valuable, but they did create significant investigative challenges. Some victims were not reported missing immediately because friends and family were accustomed to periods of absence. Others had limited contact with relatives, meaning that days or even weeks could pass before anyone realized something was seriously wrong. By the time investigators began searching, valuable opportunities to collect evidence had often been lost. Robert Lee Yates exploited these vulnerabilities with remarkable consistency. According to the evidence later presented by investigators, he drove through areas of Spokane known for street prostitution, usually during the evening or nighttime hours. He did not force women into his vehicle through obvious violence. Instead, he presented himself as an ordinary middle-aged man seeking the services they offered. His appearance worked in his favor. He was clean-cut, polite, and calm. Nothing about him immediately suggested danger. Unlike offenders whose behavior is erratic or openly threatening, Yates appeared controlled. That ordinary appearance lowered suspicion and allowed victims to enter his vehicle voluntarily, believing they were beginning an ordinary transaction rather than placing themselves in extraordinary danger. Once a victim entered his vehicle, the course of events changed dramatically. Investigators later determined that Yates typically drove away from areas with regular traffic and public visibility. Instead of remaining within the city, he selected isolated locations where interruption was unlikely. Dirt roads, wooded areas, deserted industrial spaces, and quiet roads outside Spokane became recurring features of the investigation. These locations offered privacy and reduced the likelihood that witnesses would observe either the crime itself or the disposal of the victim's body. Evidence gathered during the investigation indicated that sexual contact occurred before the murders. In multiple cases, years later, this detail would become critically important because biological evidence recovered from some victims remained preserved long enough for advances in forensic science to identify its source. At the time of the killings, however, those biological samples could not immediately reveal the identity of the offender. The murders themselves followed a strikingly consistent pattern. Unlike many serial killers who relied upon knives, strangulation, or blunt force trauma, Yates repeatedly used a firearm. Investigators concluded that he commonly employed a .25 caliber handgun. Victims were generally shot at close range, frequently in the head or upper body. In several cases, multiple gunshot wounds suggested an intention to ensure death before leaving the scene. The repeated use of the same caliber weapon would later become another important component of the forensic investigation, particularly after ballistic comparisons were performed. After the shootings, Yates abandoned the bodies rather than attempting elaborate concealment. Investigators found victims in wooded areas, alongside roads, near industrial zones, and in other remote locations surrounding Spokane. He did not consistently bury the bodies or make extensive efforts to destroy evidence. Instead, he relied upon the isolation of the locations themselves. In many cases, natural conditions delayed discovery for extended periods, increasing the difficulty of determining precise timelines and preserving forensic evidence. As the years passed, investigators documented more victims. Among those later confirmed were Shirley Helmick, Jennifer Joseph, Rita Huffman, Patricia Yellow Robe, Carol Christensen, Dana Newton, Janet Mercer, Sandra Colbert, and several other women whose deaths ultimately became linked to Robert Lee Yates. Although each woman had her own life, personality, relationships, and history, investigators observed recurring characteristics that explained why the offender repeatedly targeted them. They were women living in vulnerable circumstances, often facing addiction, financial hardship, or involvement in prostitution. Their vulnerability did not define them, but it did influence the way their disappearances were initially perceived. One of the most painful lessons of the Yates investigation concerns precisely this issue. Detectives later acknowledged that crimes involving marginalized victims often presented greater investigative obstacles. Delayed missing person reports meant fewer opportunities to gather fresh evidence. Witnesses who lived similarly unstable lives could be difficult to locate or reluctant to cooperate. Public attention was frequently limited compared to cases involving victims from more stable backgrounds. None of these realities reflected the value of the victims' lives. Yet together they created circumstances that allowed a determined offender to remain hidden for years. During the period of the murders, investigators did not immediately recognize the full pattern because the crimes unfolded gradually across nearly a decade. Each newly discovered body generated its own investigation, its own interviews, and its own forensic examination. Detectives naturally focused first on individuals closest to each victim, examining acquaintances, recent contacts, and personal relationships. Without definitive forensic links, it remained difficult to establish that the same offender was responsible for multiple deaths. The absence of modern surveillance technology further complicated the investigation. Unlike contemporary criminal investigations, there were no networks of security cameras recording vehicles entering and leaving neighborhoods. Automatic license plate readers did not exist. Mobile telephone records could not reconstruct movements because victims and suspects were not carrying smartphones capable of generating detailed location histories. Every investigative lead depended upon traditional police work, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, comparing reports, and hoping that one overlooked detail might eventually reveal the truth. Throughout these years, Robert Yates continued maintaining the public identity that shielded him from suspicion. He remained a husband, a father of 5 children, a military veteran, and a member of the National Guard. He had also worked as a correctional officer, a profession associated with enforcing the law rather than violating it. To neighbors and co-workers, he remained a quiet, dependable man whose life appeared ordinary. Nothing in his outward routine suggested that investigators searching for a serial killer should be looking at someone like him. This contrast between appearance and reality became increasingly disturbing as detectives later reconstructed the timeline. During the same years that bodies were being discovered around Spokane, Yates continued participating in ordinary family life. He went to work, he returned home, he interacted with neighbors who had no reason to fear him. The separation between his public identity and his criminal conduct remained almost complete. As investigators eventually pieced together the evidence, they realized they were confronting an offender capable of compartmentalizing 2 entirely different lives without allowing one to visibly intrude upon the other. By the late 1990s, however, subtle changes began occurring within the investigation. Detectives examining individual homicide files started noticing recurring similarities that extended beyond coincidence. The victims shared comparable backgrounds. Several had last been seen entering a man's vehicle. Many had been found in similarly isolated locations. The repeated use of a .25 caliber handgun appeared increasingly significant. Although these observations still fell short of identifying a suspect, they suggested that Spokane might not be facing unrelated homicides after all. Instead, investigators began considering the possibility that a single offender had been operating undetected for years. Even with this growing realization, enormous challenges remained. There was still no name, no arrest, and no conclusive forensic evidence identifying the killer. Robert Lee Yates continued living freely, protected by the ordinary appearance he had cultivated throughout his adult life. The investigation stood at a critical point. Detectives had begun recognizing the pattern, but recognizing a pattern and proving the identity of the person responsible were 2 very different challenges. The breakthrough would not come from eyewitness testimony alone, nor from a dramatic confession or an unexpected informant. Instead, the case was about to enter a new phase, one shaped by careful investigative persistence. A surviving witness who remembered one small but crucial detail, and scientific advances that would finally allow evidence collected years earlier to reveal the identity of the man who had remained hidden in plain sight for more than 2 decades. By the late 1990s, detectives in Spokane were no longer looking at a handful of isolated tragedies. The growing collection of case files had begun to reveal something far more troubling. Women from similar backgrounds were disappearing under similar circumstances, and many of them were later found in remote locations surrounding the city. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore, yet recognizing a pattern was not the same as solving it. Investigators still faced a fundamental problem. They knew what kind of crimes they were dealing with, but they did not know who was committing them. The investigation entered a stage defined by frustration, persistence, and the slow accumulation of details that initially seemed too small to matter. One of the greatest obstacles was the passage of time. Some of the murders stretched back years, and the first confirmed victim, Dorothy Marie Silzel, had disappeared all the way back in 1975. Detectives were forced to compare evidence collected across different decades, often by different investigators using different methods. Records were not always organized in ways that made cross-case comparisons easy. Witnesses had moved away. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had deteriorated. Every year that passed made the earlier cases more difficult to reconstruct. The victims' circumstances created additional challenges. Many had been involved in prostitution or struggled with addiction. Their daily lives often brought them into contact with numerous strangers, making it difficult to identify which encounter had become fatal. Some disappeared after telling friends they were meeting a client. Others were simply gone without explanation, because periods of absence were not unusual in some of their lives. Missing person reports were not always filed immediately. Those delays mattered. The first 24 to 48 hours of a disappearance can be critical for recovering surveillance footage, locating witnesses, preserving physical evidence, and establishing a precise timeline. In these cases, investigators frequently began their work after that window had already closed. Despite these difficulties, detectives continued reviewing each homicide carefully. They examined autopsy reports, ballistic evidence, witness statements, and geographic locations where bodies had been found. Gradually, similarities became impossible to dismiss. Many victims had been shot with a .25 caliber handgun. Several had been left in isolated outdoor areas rather than inside buildings or vehicles. The disposal sites suggested someone familiar with the region surrounding Spokane. The offender appeared comfortable driving victims away from populated areas and selecting places where discovery might be delayed. Investigators began asking a crucial question. Was this the work of one man rather than many? The answer did not arrive through a dramatic confession or a single eyewitness identification. Instead, it emerged through the careful re-examination of overlooked information. In 1997, one encounter had ended differently from the others. A woman involved in prostitution survived after meeting a man who would later become central to the investigation. She was able to provide police with a description of the vehicle and, most importantly, remember part of the license plate number. At the time, this information did not immediately lead to an arrest. The partial plate was recorded, but detectives lacked enough evidence to identify a suspect with confidence. Thousands of vehicles could potentially match an incomplete sequence of characters. And without additional corroborating evidence, the lead remained one among many. Yet investigators did not discard it. The information stayed in the case files, waiting for a moment when it might become useful. That moment arrived 2 years later. In 1999, detectives undertook a broader review of the unsolved cases. By then, the possibility of a serial offender had become increasingly plausible, and investigators began comparing records that had previously been examined separately. During this review, the partial license plate from the surviving witness was revisited and cross-referenced with vehicle registrations. One of the matches belonged to a man named Robert Lee Yates. On paper, he did not fit the stereotype many people imagined. He was a military veteran, a National Guard member, a former correctional officer, a husband, and the father of 5 children. He had steady employment and no public reputation for violent criminal behavior. Nevertheless, the vehicle connection placed him on investigators' radar for the first time. Detectives began looking more closely at his background, movements, and potential connections to the victims. Even then, the case against him remained far from complete. A vehicle registration alone was not enough to support murder charges. The partial plate could still have been coincidental. Investigators needed something far stronger. They needed evidence capable of surviving scrutiny in court. This was the moment when advances in forensic science transformed the investigation. During the years when many of the murders had occurred, DNA analysis had not been available in the sophisticated form that investigators would later use. However, biological evidence collected from some victims had been preserved. Samples that once seemed incapable of identifying a suspect were now examined using improved laboratory techniques. Detectives submitted semen recovered from multiple victims for DNA analysis. The results were striking. The samples matched the same individual. For the first time, investigators had scientific evidence suggesting that several murders were linked to one offender rather than being unrelated crimes. The next step was obtaining a comparison sample from Robert Lee Yates. According to the investigation, detectives were able to secure his DNA without alerting him to the full scope of their suspicions. When the laboratory compared his genetic profile to the evidence recovered from the victims, the results matched. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. For decades, the investigation had been driven largely by patterns, circumstantial observations, and incomplete leads. DNA provided a direct biological connection between Yates and multiple victims. The invisible evidence that had remained silent for years was finally speaking. The forensic case did not rely on DNA alone. Ballistics experts re-examined the bullets recovered from several victims and compared them to firearms associated with Yates. Their analysis concluded that the .25 caliber handgun connected to him was consistent with the weapon used in multiple murders. The repeated use of the same caliber firearm, combined with the DNA evidence, strengthened the case substantially. Investigators also considered witness statements and Yates' movements during the relevant time periods. No single piece of evidence solved every murder independently, but together they formed a powerful mosaic. The surviving witness connected a vehicle. The DNA connected biological evidence. The ballistics connected the firearm. The geographic pattern connected the disposal sites. The victim profiles connected the offender's method of selecting targets. Each element reinforced the others. By early 2000, detectives believed they had identified the man responsible for a large number of Spokane's unsolved murders. The decision to arrest him marked the culmination of years of investigative work spanning multiple agencies, evolving forensic technology, and countless hours spent reviewing old files that many people had assumed would never be solved. In April 2000, Robert Lee Yates was arrested at his workplace. The location of the arrest added another layer of shock to the case. He was not found hiding in a remote cabin or fleeing across state lines. He was taken into custody while living what appeared to be a normal life. The reaction from those around him was one of disbelief. Family members were reportedly stunned. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the allegations being announced by law enforcement. Co-workers who had interacted with him professionally found it difficult to imagine that the same individual had been linked to a series of murders stretching back decades. During the initial stages of questioning, Yates denied the accusations. Like many suspects confronted with serious criminal allegations, he did not immediately admit responsibility. Investigators responded by presenting the evidence piece by piece. The DNA results, the ballistic findings, the witness information, the connections between cases that had once appeared unrelated. As the evidence accumulated, the investigation reached the point where denial became increasingly difficult to sustain. Yates eventually acknowledged responsibility for multiple murders, including the killing of Dorothy Marie Silsel. His admissions confirmed what detectives had spent years trying to prove. The disappearances and deaths of numerous women across Spokane were not random acts committed by different offenders. They were the work of one man who had successfully hidden behind the appearance of ordinary life for more than 20 years. The investigation had finally identified the killer, but for many families, the breakthrough arrived only after decades of unanswered questions. The next chapter would move from the investigation room to the courtroom, where the evidence would be tested and the legal consequences of Robert Lee Yates' crimes would finally begin to take shape. By the time Robert Lee Yates was formally brought before the court, the investigation had already answered the question that had haunted Spokane for years. Who was responsible for the disappearances and murders of so many vulnerable women? The challenge now shifted from identifying the offender to securing justice through the legal system. prosecutors faced the task of presenting a case built upon decades of evidence collected across different time periods, supported by modern forensic science and strengthened by Yates' own admissions. Although the arrest had marked the end of his freedom, it did not immediately bring closure to the families who had waited years, sometimes decades, for answers. The legal process would become the final stage in a long journey that had begun with the disappearance of Dorothy Marie Silzel in the summer of 1975. Court proceedings involving multiple homicide victims are often lengthy and complex, particularly when the crimes span more than 20 years. Investigators and prosecutors had assembled a substantial body of evidence, including DNA analysis, ballistic examinations, witness statements, and connections established through years of investigative review. Each piece contributed to an increasingly comprehensive picture of Robert Lee Yates' crimes. Faced with this evidence, Yates ultimately chose not to contest every allegation through a full trial. In 2002, he entered guilty pleas to multiple murders. According to the available record, this decision allowed him to avoid the possibility of receiving the death penalty under the Washington state court proceedings. Instead, the state court imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. From a legal perspective, the guilty pleas spared investigators and victims' families from the uncertainty of prolonged courtroom litigation. They also eliminated the need to prove every aspect of each homicide before a jury. Nevertheless, accepting responsibility in court did not erase the years of suffering experienced by the victims' families, nor did it lessen the significance of the crimes themselves. The admissions simply confirmed, through legal proceedings, what investigators had already established through evidence. Yet the state prosecution did not conclude the legal consequences facing Robert Lee Yates. An unusual aspect of this case involved the jurisdiction over two of the murders. According to the information established during the investigation, two victims were killed while Yates was still serving as a member of the United States military. Because of the timing of those crimes and his military status, those offenses fell within the authority of the military justice system in addition to the civilian proceedings. As a result, Yates faced a second prosecution before a military court. This separate legal process illustrates how different court systems may become involved when crimes intersect with military jurisdiction. The military court examined the evidence relating to the murders that occurred while Yates remained on active military duty. After reviewing the case, the court found him guilty of intentional murder involving those victims. Unlike the outcome in the Washington state proceedings, the military court imposed a death sentence for the murders under its jurisdiction. Consequently, Robert Lee Yates received two different forms of punishment through two separate judicial systems. In the civilian courts of Washington state, he received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In the military justice system, he received a sentence of death for the murders prosecuted under military authority. According to the available information, Yates remains imprisoned within the United States military prison system, while the legal processes associated with the military death sentence have not resulted in an execution. Although the legal outcomes were significant, they represented only one dimension of the broader impact left by the case. For investigators, the Yates investigation became a powerful demonstration of the importance of preserving evidence, even when available technology cannot immediately provide answers. When Dorothy Marie Silzel disappeared in 1975, forensic science lacked the sophisticated DNA techniques that would eventually identify her killer decades later. Had biological evidence not been carefully preserved, investigators might never have been able to establish the definitive connections that ultimately solved multiple murders. The case therefore became an example frequently cited for the long-term value of maintaining evidence from unsolved crimes. Scientific advances can transform evidence once considered inconclusive into the foundation of a successful prosecution many years later. Equally important were the lessons involving victims from vulnerable communities. Many of Robert Yates' confirmed victims were women involved in prostitution, struggling with addiction, or living under extremely difficult circumstances. Their lives were often unstable, and several disappeared without immediate reports that would have triggered urgent investigations. The Yates case highlighted how these realities can unintentionally create opportunities for serial offenders. Investigators later recognized the need to approach disappearances involving vulnerable individuals with the same urgency afforded to any other missing person investigation. Every victim deserves equal attention, regardless of occupation, economic circumstances, addiction, or social status. One of the most enduring aspects of the Yates investigation is precisely this reminder. The women targeted by Yates were not defined solely by the hardships they experienced. They were daughters, friends, family members, and human beings whose lives possessed inherent value. The fact that many lived on society's margins did not make their disappearances less significant. On the contrary, the investigation demonstrated the devastating consequences that can occur when vulnerable populations receive less immediate attention than others. The preservation of biological evidence also emerged as a defining lesson. During the years when several murders occurred, detectives could collect evidence but lacked the technology necessary to identify its source. Rather than discarding those materials, investigators preserved them. Years later, developments in DNA analysis transformed those preserved samples into decisive evidence linking Robert Lee Yates to multiple victims. Without those scientific advances, prosecutors would have faced a far more difficult challenge in proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation further demonstrated the importance of reviewing unsolved cases collectively, rather than in isolation. For years, each homicide appeared to stand alone. Only after investigators compared evidence across multiple files did the recurring similarities become impossible to ignore. Patterns involving victim profiles, methods of killing, locations where bodies were abandoned, ballistic evidence, and eventually DNA all contributed to identifying the offender. The process illustrated that serial crime investigations often depend not upon one dramatic breakthrough, but upon the patient accumulation of many interconnected facts. Questions regarding Yates' motivations have never received a complete answer. Available evidence indicates that financial gain was not the primary purpose of the murders. Psychological experts involved in evaluating the case suggested several possible factors supported by the investigation, including a desire to exercise complete control over victims, hostility toward women involved in prostitution, and violent impulses. However, Yates himself never provided a clear or comprehensive explanation for why he committed these crimes. As a result, the investigation cannot offer a definitive motive beyond what the evidence reasonably supports. This absence of a clear explanation serves as another reminder that not every criminal case concludes with complete understanding. Courts can establish responsibility. Forensic science can identify the offender. Sentences can be imposed. Yet the deeper question of why certain individuals commit repeated acts of violence sometimes remains unanswered. In Robert Lee Yates' case, the available evidence reveals what he did, how investigators proved it, and how the legal system responded. It does not fully explain the inner motivations that led him to target vulnerable women over more than 2 decades. Today, Robert Lee Yates remains incarcerated, his freedom permanently removed by the consequences of his own actions. Investigators have acknowledged that they cannot entirely exclude the possibility that he may have been responsible for additional killings beyond the 13 confirmed victims. However, without sufficient evidence, no further murders have been formally attributed to him. That distinction remains important. Responsible criminal investigation depends upon evidence rather than speculation, and the confirmed record remains limited to the crimes that investigators could establish through admissions, forensic evidence, and other supporting proof. In the end, the legacy of this case belongs not to the man who committed the murders, but to the women whose lives were taken and to the investigators who refused to abandon decades-old evidence. Their persistence demonstrated that justice, although delayed, is not always denied. Advances in science gave forgotten evidence a voice. Careful investigative work connected cases once believed unrelated. Families who had spent years living with uncertainty finally received answers, even if those answers arrived far later than anyone would have wished. The story of Robert Lee Yates stands today as one of Washington State's most significant serial murder investigations, not because of the notoriety of the offender, but because it underscores enduring lessons about the value of every victim, the importance of preserving evidence, the power of forensic science, and the determination of investigators who continued searching for the truth long after many believed it would never be found. When the legal proceedings against Robert Lee Yates concluded, the criminal investigation itself had reached its final chapter. The man responsible for at least 13 confirmed murders had been identified, prosecuted, and permanently removed from society. For law enforcement, the case represented the successful resolution of one of the longest and most complicated serial murder investigations in Washington state history. Yet for the families of the victims, the conclusion of the court process did not erase decades of grief. A conviction can answer the question of who committed a crime, but it cannot restore the years that were stolen or repair the lives forever changed by violence. The true legacy of the case extends beyond the courtroom, reaching into policing, forensic science, public awareness, and the continuing effort to ensure that every victim receives equal attention regardless of background or circumstance. One of the clearest lessons to emerge from the investigation concerns the treatment of victims from vulnerable communities. Robert Lee Yates deliberately selected women who, according to the evidence, were living under exceptionally difficult circumstances. Many struggled with substance addiction. Many engaged in prostitution. Some lacked stable housing or strong support networks. These realities created practical challenges for investigators because disappearances were not always reported immediately, and witnesses were often difficult to locate. Over time, the case prompted important reflection within law enforcement. Detectives and investigators increasingly recognized that vulnerability should never translate into reduced urgency. Every missing person deserves the same commitment, regardless of occupation, addiction, financial hardship, or social standing. The Yates investigation became one example illustrating why assumptions about victims can unintentionally allow dangerous offenders to continue operating. If a disappearance is viewed as less urgent because the victim lived on society's margins, valuable investigative opportunities may be lost. In later years, many agencies across Washington placed greater emphasis on carefully reviewing missing person reports involving individuals considered especially vulnerable. While no investigative system is perfect, the lessons drawn from cases like this encourage broader recognition that every life carries equal value. Another lasting impact involved the preservation of evidence. When Dorothy Marie Silsel disappeared in 1975, investigators worked with the technology available at the time. They could collect evidence, interview witnesses, and document crime scenes. But DNA analysis capable of identifying a specific offender did not yet exist in practical criminal investigations. Had detectives concluded that preserved biological evidence no longer held value, many of the decisive forensic links established decades later would have been impossible. Instead, those samples remained available as science advanced. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, improved DNA techniques transformed evidence that had once seemed inconclusive into some of the strongest proof presented against Robert Lee Yates. The case demonstrated an important principle that continues to influence criminal investigations today. Evidence collected in the present may become far more valuable in the future as technology evolves. The investigation also highlighted the importance of examining crimes collectively rather than viewing each homicide in complete isolation. For many years, the murders connected to Yates appeared to be unrelated tragedies. Different victims disappeared at different times. Bodies were found in separate locations. Individual detectives focused on solving individual cases. Only after investigators compared victim profiles, methods of killing, ballistic evidence, witness accounts, and forensic findings across multiple files did the larger pattern become unmistakable. The process required patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. It was not one spectacular clue that solved the investigation, but the careful accumulation of many smaller pieces of evidence over time. This methodical approach serves as an example of how modern investigations increasingly rely upon collaboration, information sharing, and long-term analysis. Reviewing older files with fresh perspectives can reveal relationships that were impossible to recognize when each crime first occurred. Robert Yates himself remained an example of how outward appearances can be profoundly misleading. Throughout the years during which investigators believe he committed multiple murders, he maintained a public identity built around responsibility and stability. He served in the United States Air Force, later joined the National Guard, worked as a correctional officer, remained married, and raised 5 children. Neighbors reportedly viewed him as quiet and polite. Family members were shocked by his arrest, demonstrating the enormous divide between the man they believed they knew and the evidence eventually uncovered by investigators. This contrast has often attracted public attention because it challenges common assumptions about violent offenders. Many people expect serial killers to appear visibly dangerous or socially isolated. The Yates case instead illustrates that some offenders are capable of separating their public and private lives to an extraordinary degree. That observation should not create fear of ordinary neighbors or co-workers, but it does reinforce an important investigative principle. Conclusions must be based upon evidence rather than appearances. The investigation into Yates succeeded because detectives followed physical evidence, forensic science, witness information, and documented facts rather than relying upon stereotypes about what a serial killer should look like. Questions about Robert Lee Yates' motives remain only partially answered. Available evidence does not indicate that he murdered for financial gain. Psychological experts reviewing the case suggested that his actions may have reflected a desire for control, hostility toward women engaged in prostitution, and violent impulses. At the same time, investigators have consistently avoided presenting these observations as definitive explanations. Yates himself never provided a complete or convincing account of why he committed the murders. Consequently, the investigation closes with many factual questions answered while some psychological questions remain unresolved. This distinction matters because responsible true crime reporting separates established evidence from speculation. Courts determine legal responsibility. Investigators establish what occurred and who committed the offenses. Motive, however, can sometimes remain uncertain even after conviction. The absence of a complete explanation does not weaken the evidence supporting guilt, but it reminds us that human behavior is not always fully understood. The women whose lives were taken deserve to remain at the center of the story. Dorothy Marie Silzel, Shirley Helmick, Jennifer Joseph, Rita Huffman, Patricia Yellow Robe, Carol Christensen, Dana Newton, Janet Mercer, Sandra Colbert, and the other confirmed victims were far more than names listed in court documents. Each had a personal history, relationships, and hopes that existed long before they encountered Robert Lee Yates. Although many lived difficult lives, those hardships should never define the entirety of who they were. One of the enduring responsibilities of true crime storytelling is to restore attention to the victims rather than allowing the offender to dominate every conversation. Remembering the victims also means recognizing the families who spent years waiting for answers. For some, uncertainty lasted decades. They experienced birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary days marked by unanswered questions. Some lived without knowing whether their loved one was alive or dead until remains were eventually discovered. Others knew a family member had been murdered but had no idea who was responsible. The eventual identification of Robert Lee Yates could not erase those years. But it did provide something many families had nearly lost hope of receiving: the truth. The investigation further demonstrated the remarkable role that persistence plays in criminal justice. Detectives who first worked these cases in the 1970s and 1980s could not have predicted the scientific advances that would later become available. Nevertheless, their efforts to document evidence carefully ensured that future investigators possessed the materials necessary to continue the search. The officers who reopened old files, compared seemingly unrelated cases, re-examined witness statements, and embraced new forensic techniques all contributed to solving crimes that many once believed would remain permanently unsolved. Their work stands as a reminder that unresolved investigations are not necessarily forgotten. Investigations. Time may delay justice, but continued commitment can still produce results years later. Today, Robert Lee Yates remains incarcerated within the United States military prison system, serving the sentences imposed after his convictions. While investigators have acknowledged the possibility that he could have been connected to additional unsolved murders, the officially confirmed record remains based upon the evidence established during the investigation. That careful distinction reflects the principles of responsible law enforcement. Suspicion alone is never sufficient. Every criminal accusation must rest upon evidence capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. In the end, the Robert Lee Yates investigation became significant for reasons extending far beyond the crimes themselves. It demonstrated the growing power of DNA science, reinforced the necessity of preserving evidence, encouraged greater attention to victims from vulnerable communities, and illustrated how patient investigative work can eventually overcome even decades of uncertainty. Above all, it serves as a solemn reminder that every victim deserves to be seen, every disappearance deserves to be investigated, and every unanswered question deserves persistence. Justice in this case arrived only after many years of waiting, but it arrived because investigators refused to stop searching, because evidence was preserved until science could reveal its meaning, and because the voices of victims who had once been overlooked were ultimately heard. In cases like this, a verdict can feel like an ending to the public, but for the people left behind, it is often only the point at which the full shape of the loss becomes easier to see. By the time Robert Lee Yates was convicted and sentenced, the investigation had already transformed him from an unknown presence in Spokane into a documented serial killer whose crimes stretched across more than 2 decades. Yet the legal outcome did not undo the longer history that made the case so haunting. It did not return Dorothy Marie Silzel, whose disappearance in 1975 marked the beginning of the story. It did not return the other women whose lives were taken in the years that followed. What it did do was create an official record, one that confirmed through law what investigators had spent years proving through evidence: that a man who looked, from the outside, like an ordinary husband, father, veteran, and correctional officer had in fact hidden a violent pattern of predation behind that ordinary life. In 2002, Yates entered guilty pleas to multiple murders. That decision mattered because it removed the need for a full contested trial in the state system and led to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In a narrow legal sense, the pleas acknowledged responsibility and prevented the case from becoming an even longer courtroom struggle. But no legal procedure can capture the emotional scale of what had happened over the preceding 25 years. The women who died were not abstractions in a file. They were human beings whose disappearances had, for too long, been treated by circumstance as less urgent than they should have been. Their names had once moved through police reports, family conversations, and investigative notes. After conviction, they became part of the permanent historical record of a case that forced law enforcement and the public to confront how easily violence can hide in the margins. The sentencing also revealed an unusual feature of the case. Because 2 of the victims were killed while Yates was still serving in the military, those murders fell under military jurisdiction as well as civilian concern. That meant the case did not end with the state court proceedings. A separate military prosecution followed, and the military court concluded that Yates was guilty of intentional murder in those two killings. The result was a death sentence within the military justice system. This dual outcome created a strange kind of legal finality. On one side stood the state's sentences of life without parole. On the other stood a military death sentence that, according to the available record, has not been carried out. Together, they reflected the seriousness of the crimes, but they also underscored how long and complicated the road to justice had been. By the time the courts acted, decades had already passed since the earliest murder and years had passed since the last known one. In that interval, the victims' families had lived through uncertainty, grief, and the painful experience of watching time move on while their questions remained unanswered. One of the most enduring consequences of the case is that it exposed how vulnerability can shape the course of an investigation. Many of Yates' known victims were women involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction. Some were living on the streets. Some had unstable contact with family. Because of that, their disappearances were not always treated with the immediacy that might have followed if they had been from more secure and visible backgrounds. This does not diminish the care of the detectives who worked the case. Rather, it explains the environment in which the killer operated. He repeatedly selected women whose absences were easier to overlook, whose movements were harder to trace, and whose deaths could remain hidden longer. That fact is central to understanding the case because it shows that the violence was not random in the broadest sense. It was targeted, deliberate, and enabled by social conditions that made certain victims less visible to the systems meant to protect them. The investigation eventually corrected that imbalance, but only after the damage had already been done. The role of DNA in the case cannot be overstated. Without the preserved biological evidence and the later advances that allowed scientists to analyze it, Yates may have remained just another suspect on a long list of possibilities. The DNA did something that witness memory alone could not do. It crossed decades. It connected cases. It turned suspicion into proof. In the late 1970s and through much of the 1980s, that evidence could not be fully understood. By the late 1990s, it could. That shift is one reason this case became so important to investigators. It demonstrated that evidence from an old scene is never necessarily useless. What appears inconclusive in one era can become decisive in another. That lesson has value far beyond Spokane. It reminds agencies everywhere that care in evidence preservation is not just bureaucratic procedure. It is a long-term investment in truth. The same is true of the decision to review the cases together rather than separately. For years, the murders looked disconnected. Different women, different dates, different places, different initial files. But once investigators stepped back and compared the details, the similarities became hard to dismiss. The repeated use of a .25 caliber handgun, the isolated disposal locations, the victim profiles, and the testimony from a surviving woman who remembered part of a license plate all became part of a larger picture. No one clue solved the case by itself. The solution emerged because investigators were willing to return to the material, reread the old records, and look for the common thread that had been hidden in plain sight. That kind of work is slow. It rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. But in a case like this, patience becomes one of the most powerful tools available. Yates' public identity also became part of the legacy. He had served in the Air Force, worked in the National Guard, been employed as a correctional officer, and lived as a married father of 5. Those facts mattered because they made the case so difficult to imagine from the outside. He was not living in obvious isolation. He was not visibly unstable in the way people often expect offenders to be. He was integrated into the life of the community. That is what made the case so disturbing to so many people after his arrest. It forced a confrontation with the possibility that some offenders do not look the way the public expects them to look. They can be ordinary in daily presentation and still commit extraordinary harm. The lesson is not paranoia. The lesson is caution in judgment and seriousness in investigation. After conviction, Yates remained confined in the United States military prison system. The available information indicates that his military death sentence has not been executed. That detail leaves the case in an unusual state. Legally resolved in the sense that guilt has been established and punishment imposed, but emotionally unresolved for the families and for anyone who sees the case as a measure of how society treats those on the margins. For many, the most important part of the story is not the final sentence, but the fact that the victims were eventually identified. The pattern was finally understood, and the truth was recorded. That truth matters because it restores dignity where there had been neglect. It gives names and context to women who might otherwise have remained remembered only as entries in old files. It also sets a standard for future investigations. Missing persons cases involving vulnerable people must be treated with urgency. Old evidence must be preserved. Separate files must be compared. Patterns must not be dismissed too quickly. These are not abstract lessons. They were purchased in this case through years of loss. In the end, the Robert Lee Yates case stands as a record of both failure and persistence. It shows how a murderer can hide behind normalcy for years, how social vulnerability can delay justice, and how forensic science can eventually break open even a decades-old mystery. But it also shows the persistence of investigators who refuse to let the cases disappear into history. They continued to look. They kept old evidence. They revisited partial clues. They connected the past to the present until the truth could no longer be avoided. That truth is grim, but it is also necessary. It reminds us that the victims mattered, that their deaths were not forgotten forever, and that justice, though delayed, can still arrive when people are willing to keep searching for it. When a case like Robert Lee Yates finally reaches its legal conclusion, it can be tempting to think of the story as complete, as if the arrest, the guilty pleas, the military conviction, and the sentences together form a clean ending that closes the book on everything that came before. But true crime rarely ends that way. In reality, the conclusion of a case often reveals the deepest consequences of all. Because once the suspect is no longer the focus, the attention shifts back to the lives that were taken, the families that were left behind, and the system that took so long to see what was happening in front of it. That is where the real legacy of the Robert Lee Yates case lives. Not in the image of the man himself, but in the long shadow his crimes cast over Spokane, over the families of the victims, and over the investigators who had to piece together a pattern that had been hidden for more than 2 decades. Yates was eventually identified as the killer responsible for at least 13 confirmed murders between 1975 and 1998, with investigators believing there may have been more victims. That number alone is staggering, but it does not fully capture the burden carried by the case. Each of those women had a life before she became part of a homicide file. Each had a name, a history, relationships, and a place in the world that was taken from her. The fact that many of them were women living in poverty, struggling with addiction, or working as prostitutes made them more vulnerable to predation. But it should never have made them less visible to the people meant to protect them. One of the clearest lessons from the Yates investigation is the danger of allowing social prejudice to shape urgency. When a vulnerable person disappears, the case must not be treated as less important because the victim lived on the margins. The tragedy of this investigation is that the killer appears to have understood that vulnerability very well. He chose women he believed were easier to isolate, easier to approach, and, crucially, easier for society to overlook if something happened to them. That is not a speculation pulled from outside the record. It is the basic shape of the facts as they emerged through the investigation. The victims were repeatedly drawn from communities where disappearance could go unnoticed long, enough for a murderer to continue operating. That reality made the case a painful example of how structural neglect can create opportunity for violence. Yet the case also showed what persistence can accomplish. For many years, the murders around Spokane seemed disconnected. They involved different women, different dates, different scenes, and different circumstances. Some victims were discovered far from where they had last been seen. Some were found long after their deaths, making early investigative work much more difficult. The first confirmed victim, Dorothy Marie Silzel, disappeared in 1975. But her remains were not discovered until 1985, long after the trail had grown cold. For years after that, Yates remained hidden behind the appearance of ordinary life. He served in the Air Force, later in the National Guard, worked as a correctional officer, lived as a husband and father, and did not publicly resemble the kind of man the community would suspect of these crimes. That public identity mattered because it helped him stay concealed, but it also mattered in the end because it made the eventual revelation so devastating. The case taught investigators and the public alike that outward normalcy does not guarantee inner safety. A man can appear quiet, steady, and responsible while carrying out a double life that destroys other people. This lesson is uncomfortable, but it is part of what the case leaves behind. The investigation itself also became a lesson in how evidence should be preserved and revisited. In earlier years, the technology available to law enforcement could not identify Yates through DNA, even though biological evidence had been collected from some victims. If those samples had been lost or discarded, the case might never have been solved. Instead, the preserved evidence became invaluable once forensic science advanced. That is one reason the Yates case continues to matter so much to investigators. It proved that a file closed by one generation may still be opened by the next. Evidence collected carefully and stored properly can remain powerful for decades. That principle has broad importance beyond this single case. It means that old evidence should not be dismissed simply because it was once beyond the reach of technology. In the Yates investigation, the preserved biological material, along with the partial license plate remembered by a surviving witness and the ballistic evidence linked to the .25 caliber handgun, created the chain that finally led to the arrest in April 2000. That arrest brought an end to Yates' freedom, but it did not erase the years during which the crimes had gone unsolved. His eventual guilty pleas in 2002 and the resulting life sentences without parole in state court confirmed what the evidence had already shown. The military prosecution of the two murders committed while he was still in service added a further layer, ending with a military death sentence. Even so, the final legal outcome did not create emotional closure in any simple sense. For the families, closure is not a word that captures the reality of what they endured. The discovery that a loved one was dead, the years spent not knowing what happened, the way ordinary life had to continue around unanswered questions, and the ultimate confirmation that one man had been responsible for so much loss. None of that is resolved simply because a court enters a verdict. What the verdict does provide is official recognition. It says that the victims mattered enough for the system to keep pursuing the truth until it could be proven. It says that the dead were not forgotten forever. It says that the investigation, though delayed, eventually found its target. The case also leaves behind a quiet but powerful moral reminder about attention. Not attention to the killer, but attention to the people who were harmed. In true crime, there is always a risk that the offender becomes the central figure simply because the offender generated the mystery. But in the Robert Yates case, the more important story is not who he was in the abstract. It is what happened to the women he targeted and how long it took for their disappearances to be understood as part of a pattern. Their names should remain the emotional center of the case: Dorothy Marie Silzel, Shirley Helmick, Jennifer Joseph, Rita Huffman, Patricia Yellow Robe, Carol Christensen, Dana Newton, Janet Mercer, Sandra Colbert, and the others confirmed in the investigation. Each name represents a life interrupted, a family altered, and a community challenged to confront how long violence can remain unseen. There is also a broader legacy in the way this case changed thinking about law enforcement priorities. It reinforced the need to take missing persons cases seriously from the beginning, especially when the missing person is from a vulnerable group. It underscored the value of reviewing old cases together rather than in isolation. It demonstrated that eyewitness memory, partial vehicle information, DNA, and ballistics can each matter enormously when pieced together with patience. Most importantly, it showed that justice may arrive slowly, but it can still arrive if investigators continue to search for the truth. That truth was not elegant or comforting. It was bleak, repetitive, and devastating. But it was real, and it finally gave shape to years of uncertainty. Robert Lee Yates remains imprisoned in the United States military prison system, and the official record still stands as the final legal answer to a case that once seemed unsolvable. Yet the real final answer belongs to the victims. They were not the anonymous figures of a cold case forever lost to time. Through persistence, science, and careful investigation, they were eventually returned to the center of the story. That is what the Robert Lee Yates case ultimately leaves behind, a warning about how easily the vulnerable can be ignored, a lesson about the power of preserved evidence, and a reminder that even after years of silence, truth can still speak. Even after Robert Lee Yates was arrested, convicted, and sentenced, one difficult question remained. Was the complete story of his crimes ever fully known? Investigators established that Yates was responsible for at least 13 confirmed murders, creating one of the most serious serial murder cases in Washington state history. Yet throughout the investigation, authorities acknowledged that the true number of victims could potentially be higher. This uncertainty is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. A conviction can establish responsibility for proven crimes, but it cannot always reveal the full extent of an offender's actions. In the case of Robert Lee Yates, investigators were able to build a strong legal case around the murders supported by evidence, but they could not definitively attribute every unsolved disappearance to him. The distinction between suspicion and proof remained essential. The criminal justice system could only move forward with the cases where evidence established a clear connection. Everything else remained an unanswered question. The possibility that additional victims existed was connected to the nature of Yates' criminal behavior and the long period during which he remained undetected. His known activity extended from 1975 to 1998, a span of more than 20 years. During that time, he maintained a normal public identity while investigators struggled to connect separate cases. The length of this period naturally raised questions. If he had been capable of committing multiple murders over such a long time, could there have been other victims whose cases were never connected to him? Investigators considered that possibility, but they were careful not to claim more than the evidence allowed. This restraint was important. Serial murder investigations often generate speculation after an offender is identified. Old missing person cases may be reviewed. Similar crimes may be examined for possible connections. But similarities alone do not prove responsibility. A responsible investigation must be guided by evidence rather than assumptions. This principle remained central to the Yates case. The confirmed victims represented the crimes that could be proven. Beyond that, investigators could only continue examining information without drawing unsupported conclusions. One factor that made the question of additional victims especially complicated was Yates' mobility and background. His military service meant that he had lived and worked in different environments over the course of his life. Investigators considered the possibility that his movements may have allowed him to commit crimes outside Spokane or outside the cases already connected to him. However, available information did not establish additional murders beyond the confirmed victims. The possibility remained open, but the official record was based only on what investigators could demonstrate. Another challenge came from the passage of time. When crimes occur over many years, evidence can disappear, witnesses can become unavailable, and memories can change. In Yates' case, some of the earliest events occurred decades before his arrest. Dorothy Marie Silzel's disappearance in 1975 represented the beginning of the known timeline. But by the time investigators identified Yates as the offender, more than 20 years had passed. The fact that evidence survived long enough to solve several cases was remarkable. But the passage of time also meant that some questions might never receive complete answers. Families who had spent years waiting for information faced the painful reality that not every missing person case could necessarily be resolved. This uncertainty is one of the hardest aspects of serial crime investigations. Even when an offender is captured, the investigation does not always end with complete knowledge. There can still be gaps. There can still be unanswered questions. There can still be names missing from the story. The Yates case demonstrates that justice and certainty are not always the same thing. The justice system can establish guilt based on evidence presented in court, but it cannot always reconstruct every moment of an offender's life or every crime that may have occurred. This limitation does not reduce the importance of the convictions. Instead, it highlights the difficult reality faced by investigators working with incomplete information. In many ways, the uncertainty surrounding possible additional victims reflects the broader challenge of identifying serial offenders. These crimes often remain hidden because they do not begin as a recognized series. They appear as separate incidents. A missing woman may be treated as an individual case. A recovered body may be investigated without a known connection to other victims. Only later, after patterns emerge, does the possibility of a serial offender become visible. In Spokane, investigators eventually recognized those patterns. But that recognition came after years of unanswered questions. By the time Yates was identified, investigators had to work backward, reviewing old evidence and searching for connections that had not been visible when the crimes first occurred. The case also illustrates why victims from vulnerable communities require particular attention. Many of Yates' known victims were women whose lives involved significant challenges. Their circumstances made them easier for a predator to approach and more difficult for authorities to track after they disappeared. This vulnerability was one reason the investigation took so long to uncover the full pattern. When victims are socially isolated, their disappearances may not immediately receive the same level of attention, creating opportunities for offenders to continue. The Yates case reinforced the importance of recognizing that vulnerability does not make a person less worthy of protection. Every disappearance represents a person whose absence matters. Every unidentified victim represents a family searching for answers. While the investigation ultimately solved many of the Spokane murders, it also served as a reminder that law enforcement must constantly improve how it responds to cases involving vulnerable individuals. The story of Robert Lee Yates is therefore not only about a criminal who was caught. It is also about the unanswered questions that remain after the arrest of any serial offender. It asks difficult questions about how many opportunities a killer may have had before being identified, how many warning signs may have been overlooked, and how many families may have lived with uncertainty while investigators search for connections. Those questions do not always have clear answers, but they are important because they influence how future investigations are conducted. One of the most significant lessons from the case is that time does not eliminate the possibility of justice. Evidence that appears weak today may become powerful tomorrow. A forgotten witness statement, an old biological sample, or a previously unrelated case file may eventually become the key to solving a mystery. The investigation into Yates demonstrated exactly this principle. A partial license plate remembered by a survivor, evidence preserved from years-old crime scenes, and forensic technology that did not exist when the murders first occurred eventually combined to reveal the truth. For future investigators, this case became an example of why unresolved crimes should remain active in memory. A case that appears impossible today may not remain impossible forever. The unanswered questions surrounding Robert Lee Yates also serve as a reminder of the importance of humility in criminal investigations. Even after a major breakthrough, investigators must acknowledge what is known and what remains uncertain. Declaring responsibility for crimes without evidence would not honor victims or serve justice. The families affected by these crimes deserve truth, not speculation. They deserve facts supported by investigation, not rumors created by public fascination. In the years following Yates' conviction, his name became permanently associated with one of Washington's most disturbing criminal cases. But the final measure of the investigation should not be the number of crimes attributed to him or the mystery surrounding possible additional victims. The most important measure is that the women whose lives were taken were finally recognized, their cases connected, and their stories brought into the light. The possibility of other victims remains one of the darker questions surrounding the case, but it does not erase what has already been proven. The confirmed victims remain central. Their lives, their families, and their memories are the foundation of the investigation. Robert Lee Yates' crimes created decades of pain, but the search for truth demonstrated something equally important: that unanswered questions can continue to be pursued, that evidence can survive across generations, and that justice can still emerge even after years of silence. The case may never reveal every detail of the past, but it revealed enough to show how a single offender could hide for decades, and how determined investigators could eventually uncover the truth. The story of Robert Lee Yates is ultimately a story about time. It is a story about what can happen when violence remains hidden for years, when victims disappear without immediate answers, and when investigators are forced to search through decades of uncertainty to find the truth. It is also a story about persistence, the persistence of families who continued to seek answers, the persistence of investigators who returned to old evidence, and the persistence of science that eventually revealed connections that had once seemed impossible to prove. By the time Robert Lee Yates was identified, arrested, and convicted, the crimes had already stretched across more than 20 years. The investigation had crossed generations of law enforcement, changes in technology, and years of unanswered questions. Yet despite the passage of time, the evidence remained, and eventually it was enough to bring the truth into the open. Robert Lee Yates was born in Spokane, Washington, on September 27, 1952. Throughout much of his adult life, he maintained the image of a responsible and ordinary man. He served in the United States Air Force, later continued his military connection through the National Guard, worked as a correctional officer, became a husband, and raised 5 children. To those who knew him casually, he appeared quiet, polite, and dependable. That image was one of the reasons the case was so difficult for many people to understand after his arrest. The man accused of committing multiple murders was not someone who had openly appeared dangerous to the outside world. He was someone who had built a life that seemed completely separate from the crimes investigators eventually connected to him. But behind that public identity was a pattern of violence that lasted for decades. The first confirmed victim connected to Yates was Dorothy Marie Silsel, a 21-year-old woman who disappeared in July 1975 after leaving a party in Spokane. At the time, investigators could not identify the person responsible for her disappearance. Her remains were not discovered until years later, and even then, available technology could not reveal the identity of her killer. For a long time, Dorothy's case existed without resolution, like many other cases where the truth remained hidden simply because science had not yet advanced far enough. Her story represented the beginning of a pattern that investigators would only understand much later. From the late 1980s through 1998, more women disappeared around Spokane. Many shared similar circumstances. They were vulnerable women, often involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction. They were frequently last seen entering a vehicle with a male customer or acquaintance, after which they vanished. When bodies were discovered, investigators began noticing similarities. Many victims had been shot with a .25 caliber handgun. Their bodies were left in isolated areas, including remote roads, open land, or places where discovery might be delayed. The crime showed consistency. The offender appeared organized, patient, and familiar with how to avoid immediate detection. The investigation into these murders became difficult because the victims' cases were not initially connected. Each disappearance carried its own circumstances. Each crime scene offered only part of the answer. Years passed before investigators could recognize that these were not separate tragedies but part of a larger pattern. The breakthrough came through the combination of persistence and technology. A surviving woman who encountered Yates in 1997 provided an important clue by remembering part of a vehicle license plate. At the time, the information was not enough to immediately identify a suspect, but it remained part of the investigative record. When detectives later reviewed the cases and reconsidered earlier information, the vehicle connection helped lead them toward Robert Yates. However, investigators still needed stronger proof. The turning point came from DNA evidence. Biological samples preserved from some victims were examined using improved forensic methods. The results linked the evidence to the same individual. When investigators compared those results with DNA connected to Robert Yates, the match provided a powerful connection between him and the crimes. Additional evidence strengthened the case. Ballistic analysis connected bullets recovered from victims with a firearm associated with Yates. Witness information and other investigative findings supported the conclusion that he was responsible for multiple murders. The case that had remained unsolved for years finally had a suspect whose connection could be demonstrated through science and evidence rather than speculation. In April 2000, Robert Lee Yates was arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. People who had interacted with him as a neighbor, coworker, or acquaintance struggled to understand how someone with such an ordinary public life could be connected to such serious crimes. His arrest represented the collapse of the identity he had maintained for decades. During questioning, Yates initially denied the allegations. However, as investigators presented the DNA evidence, ballistic findings, and other connections, he eventually acknowledged responsibility for multiple murders. His admissions confirmed what the investigation had already established. The women whose cases had once appeared unrelated had been victims of the same offender. The legal consequences followed. In 2002, Yates pleaded guilty to multiple murders in the Washington state court system. He received multiple sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, because 2 victims were killed while he remained connected to military service, he also faced prosecution under military law. The military court found him guilty of intentional murder and sentenced him to death for those offenses. He remains imprisoned within the United States military prison system while the procedures connected to that sentence have not resulted in execution. Yet the end of the legal process did not represent the end of the impact of the case. The Robert Lee Yates investigation changed how many people viewed crimes involving vulnerable victims. It demonstrated the importance of treating every missing person case seriously, regardless of a person's occupation, addiction history, or social circumstances. It showed that people living on the margins of society can become targets precisely because others may not notice their absence quickly enough. It also reinforced the importance of preserving evidence. The DNA that eventually helped identify Yates was not useful when the evidence was first collected. Only later, when technology improved, did that evidence become decisive. The lesson was clear. Old evidence can still hold the answers to crimes that seem impossible to solve. The case also demonstrated the importance of reviewing unsolved crimes collectively. A single murder may provide limited information. A series of connected cases can reveal a pattern. By comparing victim profiles, methods, locations, ballistic evidence, and forensic results, investigators transform scattered information into a complete picture. The investigation was not solved through one dramatic discovery, but through years of careful work. The victims remain the most important part of this story. Dorothy Marie Silzel, Shirley Helmick, Jennifer Joseph, Rita Huffman, Patricia Yellow Robe, Carol Christensen, Dana Newton, Janet Mercer, Sandra Colbert. And the other confirmed victims were not simply names connected to a criminal investigation. They were individuals whose lives existed before their deaths. They had families, memories, and futures that were taken away. Their circumstances made them vulnerable, but those circumstances should never define their worth. The lasting responsibility of remembering this case is to ensure that the victims are not overshadowed by the person who harmed them. Robert Lee Yates became known because of his crimes, but the reason the investigation mattered was because of the women whose lives were lost. Their cases mattered. Their disappearances mattered. Their families' search for answers mattered. The final lesson of the Robert Lee Yates case is not simply that a serial killer was eventually captured. It is that truth can survive even when it takes years to uncover. Evidence can wait. Investigations can continue. Forgotten cases can return to the public eye. And victims who were once overlooked can eventually receive the recognition they deserve. The story of Robert Lee Yates ends with a conviction, but the meaning of the case extends beyond the courtroom. It remains a reminder of the importance of compassion, persistence, scientific progress, and the responsibility to seek justice for every victim, especially those whose voices are the easiest for society to ignore.